Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. In 1841, Charles Mackay wrote, "We find that whole communities fix their minds upon one object and go mad in its pursuit. Millions of people become simultaneously impressed with one delusion and run after it till their attention is caught by some new folly more captivating than the first." And he also said, "Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one." Yesterday, Al Gore, who's made hundreds of millions of dollars pushing the climate scam, spoke to COP27. He told them, "Choose life over death. It's not time for moral cowardice." And the Barbados Prime Minister called for a 10% tax on fossil fuel companies, which he said made $200 billion in profits in the last 3 months. Taxing fossil fuel companies would raise energy prices, which would transfer money from the pockets of the poor and middle class into the pockets of the government. It's kind of a reverse Robin Hood scheme. And she said, "I don't need to repeat the horror and the devastation wreaked upon this earth over the course of the last 12 months since we met in Glasgow. Whether the apocalyptic floods in Pakistan or the heat waves from Europe to China, or indeed in the last few days in my own region, the devastation caused in Belize by Tropical Storm Lisa or the torrential floods a few days ago in St. Lucia." So she listed a few weather events and implied that they were caused by the burning of fossil fuels. Apparently, she doesn't know much about the history of her own country, Barbados. In 1831, Barbados was hit by a hurricane with 200-mile-per-hour winds. They had 70-foot waves and as many as 2,500 people died. Here's a newspaper article from the New York Evening Post on September 17, 1831. "The hurricane passed over the ill-fated island of Barbados on the night of the 10th, and in 8 hours left it desolate, covered with ruins and dead bodies." And that was the second time that happened to Barbados. They were hit by several hurricanes in 1780, which destroyed every single structure on the island. The 1780 Great Hurricane was the deadliest Atlantic hurricane on record, killing about 24,000 people. The wind blew so strong that it stripped the bark off the trees. Meteorologists are of the opinion that this effect is produced on wind velocities of over 200 miles per hour. British Admiral Rodney wrote that the wind carried aloft 100 feet the heavy cannons of the ground fortifications. And that was just one of 5 major hurricanes in the Atlantic during 1780. On June 13, 1780, a hurricane swept through the Caribbean, striking St. Lucia, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. The storm killed 4,000 to 5,000 people in Puerto Rico and an unknown number at St. Lucia and the Dominican Republic. Yesterday, the Barbados Prime Minister was blaming floods at St. Lucia on the burning of fossil fuels, but I don't think they were using a lot of fossil fuels in 1780. In August of 1780, a hurricane passed over New Orleans with very high winds and destroyed nearly every building on Grand Isle, Louisiana. Then another hurricane in the Caribbean killed another 1,000 people in early October 1780. On October 10, 1780, the deadliest hurricane on record in the Atlantic passed over the Caribbean again, devastated St. Lucia, and killed as many as 27,500 people. That was the second major hurricane to hit St. Lucia during 1780. Later in October 1780, a hurricane crossed over western Cuba and killed at least 2,000 people. It's unfortunate that the Barbados Prime Minister doesn't seem to know much about the history of her region. 1780 brought the deadliest Atlantic hurricane, and it also brought the third deadliest Pacific typhoon. Among the 25 deadliest Atlantic hurricanes from 1492 to 1996, 8 occurred between 1767 and 1891, and 6 occurred between 1928 and 1935. The reason I'm using 1996 as an end date is because that's the end date of the NOAA report which I used to generate this graph. Hurricane Katrina occurred in the year 2005 and is not included on this graph. But the vast majority of the 25 deadliest hurricanes occurred before the year 1940. There was a lot of bad weather in 1780. On May 19, 1780, the skies over New England turned black because of smoke from huge forest fires in Canada. The island of St. Vincent was stripped bare by the 1780 hurricane, and then it happened again in 1898. The New York Times reported, "Whole country swept bare. Distress of the people described as exceeding that caused by the Great Famine in India." The famine from 1896 to 1902 killed 19 million people in India and 10 million people in China. 1898 was one of the worst years for wildfires in the United States and around the world. South Carolina was hit by an incredible wildfire during the winter, which burned up 3 million acres of forest in just over 24 hours. Hundreds of miles of forest were burned in the Carolinas during February 1898. At that same time, there were massive forest fires burning all over Tasmania. Australia was simultaneously experiencing severe bushfires and floods. A state forest in New Zealand was on fire from end to end. By April 1898, Northern California was on fire. During October 1898, Colorado experienced their most extensive fires on record. The New York Times reported that the fires covered most of the northwest quadrant of the state, and Wisconsin was having massive forest fires at the same time. 1898 was a brutal year for hurricanes and forest fires, and there weren't a lot of people driving sport utility vehicles during 1898. 2 years later, during September 1900, was the second deadliest Atlantic hurricane, which destroyed Galveston, Texas, and killed around 10,000 people. The Prime Minister of Barbados blamed floods in Pakistan on the use of fossil fuels. In 1970, East Pakistan was hit by a cyclone that killed around 500,000 people. According to the World Meteorological Organization, it was the world's deadliest known tropical cyclone. The storm surge from that cyclone was 34.8 feet, or 10.6 meters. Nobody blamed the 1970 cyclone on global warming. At that time, climatologists were worried about global cooling. New York Times, July 18, 1970. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. In 1972, 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University and then sent a letter to President Nixon warning of an ice age in about a century. Like many politicians, the Barbados Prime Minister appears to be unaware of the difference between weather and climate, and she believes that her superstitions about climate can be fixed by shutting down fossil fuels, which her country depends on to survive. She listed 4 or 5 disasters as being evidence of climate change. But in 1927, the Red Cross reported 111 disasters, which included 29 tornadoes, 24 floods, 23 fires, 4 earthquakes, and 9 hurricanes. These included the worst flood in U.S. history on the Mississippi River, which lasted for 6 months and permanently displaced hundreds of thousands of people. Vermont had their worst flood in history, which wiped out more than 1,000 bridges and drowned the lieutenant governor. St. Louis was largely destroyed by a tornado during 1927. There was lots and lots of other very bad weather around that time, but I think I've made my point. I'm going to finish this up with Charles Mackay's quote from 1841 once again. "Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one." That's Toto's goal, to help people recover their senses one by one. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki, and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.